Today on the Strong Women podcast, we have Missy Wallace. And Missy was actually nominated as a guest for the podcast by our good friend Cheryl Batchelder. So we're so excited to get to know Missy along with you guys, our listeners. Missy is a managing director of Redeemer City to City. And Redeemer City to City is a nonprofit that actually Tim Keller started. And she also has a BA in economics from Vanderbilt, and she has an MBA as well. And she spent about 10 years in the corporate world and then started the Nashville Institute for Faith and Work. So we're excited to talk to her about integrating these two things that we don't always integrate well, which is faith and work. And I should mention also, you've been married to your husband for 25 years and you have 3 grown children. So thanks for being on.
Yeah, thank you. It's an honor to be here.
So Missy, we want to start with going way back in your story to, did you grow up in a Christian home, and where did you grow up?
I grew up in Texas, and I grew up in a Christian home. However, I would say at the time, the home was more cultural Christianity. And so I was semi-churched. My mom went to church. I went to church with my mom. My dad never went to church. But I feel that the way Christianity was presented in my life in recollection was more like Girl Scouts. Something like that. It's an activity that you go to learn how to be a better person. So I was church, but I'm not sure I fully understood the gospel or that my family fully understood the gospel. And my parents divorced in middle school. Then I went through a couple of other tough things in middle and high school. And so I think the first time I really understood the freedom in the gospel was through Young Life in high school.
Oh, okay. So in high school, what sounds like was a tumultuous time at home and other things. So that's when you got connected with Young Life. And was that kind of the first time you heard the gospel?
You know, I don't have a story that has a lightning bolt moment. And so I think that however, I know that Young Life was the exact time that I understood that there was more to Christianity than showing up at Sunday school and hearing a message about how to be a better person. And so I think Young Life would be where I first, at least owned or recall or had some type of experience that where God led me into receiving something more. And interestingly, though, that when I headed off to college, I don't think I was properly equipped quite yet to really live into it all. After I had some experiences in Young Life, I actually independently switched churches in high school. So the church that I attended with my mom was not a church focused on Scripture. And so I really was drawn more to wanting to learn more about Scripture. So I started attending this church on my own down the street that drew me more into Scripture. And then one of my friend's big sisters led us through a Bible study. And then I launched off to college. And I went to college at Vanderbilt in Nashville, where I live now. And I had a tremendous college experience. But I did college trying to be in the world and of the world, kind of the both and thing, drink the tequila on Saturday night and go to church on Sunday morning. And, I kind of say that is when Jesus really, I put him in the trunk of the car. And I really had the next kind of decade and a half of seeing Christianity as a self-help tool or an accessory of some sort. I think it was more than cultural Christianity, but it was not full surrender. So it was, I do believe in God, I do believe in Jesus, but it's there to help me, right? It's a self-help tool. It's an accessory for me to do better on my up and to the right, shiny penny, double down, try harder, bootstrapper life. And so it's very much I can do anything if I just try hard enough. Oh, if not, let me check in with Jesus, or let me go to church, right?
Let me just call my friends real quick.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
Well, okay, so a decade and a half is a very specific amount of time. I feel like something jolted you into realizing there's more to this.
Yes.
Is that true? Did something happen?
A decade and a half was an estimate, so it wasn't exact, but some specific things did happen. So I worked for 3 years in banking and then with Jesus in the trunk. So it's really important that I say that, because if anybody knew me early in my career and then they hear what I have to say about faith and work, they're going to say, really, you hypocrite? But isn't that the beauty of the gospel, that we get slowly or quickly pulled further and further into part of God's unfolding story. But I worked 3 years in banking, and then I went to Northwestern for business school. And coming out of business school, Jesus was in the trunk. Did not go to church one time in business school, not once. Business school is interesting. I loved business school, but business school is the most narcissistic thing I think that exists in America. You show up on the first day and they say, how can we make you better, stronger, more successful? What do you want? What do you want? What will make you better? And so it's just a very, you're the center of the story, right? And really the gospel calls us to be part of God's unfolding story, and God's the center of the story, and Jesus is the center of the story, the Trinity is the center of the story. And so this inculcation to the, culture of business school. Anyway, I graduated and went to work for a major management consulting firm, stayed in Chicago, and then moved to Southeast Asia. I got married right after business school too. So we moved to Southeast Asia together. And I worked in Singapore and Bangkok for a couple years in this consulting environment. Jesus was in the trunk. Saw so many interesting corporate opportunities while working in Southeast Asia, but also saw very close hand some of the pains and poverty that exist in Southeast Asia that I had not really experienced seeing before on a regular basis. Still wasn't clicking for me yet. Moved back to New York City and started having children. And when I started having children is when I'm like, I think I need to re-engage in church. But again, it was around a self-help accessory. I want to raise nice children. I want help doing that. I need my children to be better, and I need help raising children. The church must be a great place to do that, right? And so, however, I did, when I got back into church, I got pulled into some Bible study and joined BSF in New York. And I remember studying Mark with BSF and just really being drawn in. Unbeknownst to me, was getting prepared for a part one of a suffering story. Really starting to understand, again, the reality of the surrender, the reality of what the gospel means. Had my first child, had my pregnancy of my second child, and my second child was born with a birth defect. And so I think that's the first time since, 7th grade where I couldn't work hard my way out of a problem, right? Or I couldn't be nice my way out of a problem. So I had a theology, I kind of call it the up and to the right. If you work hard enough, life will just get better for you. Kind of an up and to the right theology. And this was the first time I was faced with something that said, I'm not sure if my theology works on this one. And he went straight from me to surgery. He couldn't live with the birth defect he had. And the surgery went well, but the recovery was a little bumpy. And there was a time when they came and told us, if your son doesn't do something in the next 12 hours, he'll be permanently with a colon bag outside of his body instead of inside of his body. And that was a bummer, right? I mean, nobody wants a child to have to bear their colon outside their body. And our pastor came and prayed over the incubator that day. And within an hour of her leaving, this was weeks into a hospital stay, within an hour of her leaving, what they were waiting for happened. But I couldn't receive it yet. Couldn't receive it. I was like, wow, that is an interesting coincidence. I mean, I didn't say it quite like that, but in retrospect, it was like, wow, the science is working, and how nice of my pastor to come and make us feel better, right? How nice of God to make me feel better. So I still was struggling. So I kind of teased that at that point, Jesus was in the back seat. So he's like leaning in, telling me how to drive, but I still got him in the back seat. And so, the story progresses, but right now at that point, he is in the back seat.
Yeah. So, okay, you mentioned going into I think you mentioned college and feeling like you weren't equipped. And is this kind of what you're referring to? Like you really weren't equipped with this view of what God has to say about all of our lives, or about suffering, or about, because it sounds like, yeah, it was the first time, besides probably your parents' divorce, maybe, that this was out of your control. Your son's born with this birth defect. You can't work your way out of it. And is this where you mean like you weren't equipped with kind of integrating what God has to say about all of this, or what do you think you meant by that?
I think my theology was only a salvation theology. And so a salvation theology said that you're saved, and so when you get to heaven, everything's going to be fine, and good luck dealing with all this stuff down here on earth while you're alone, right, on your own. And that go get him, tiger, right? And so I think that my son's birth defect, I now think, was preparing me for kind of a harder trial that we would endure in the coming years that, I kind of say was the real baseball bat. But I had a theology that I was responsible for my unfolding story, that was my unfolding story, until I got to heaven. And I'd accepted Christ, so I would end up in heaven. And God was kind of a feel-good thing for this time, Whereas really, what I came to really understand later was God is the center of the story. Christ is the center of the story. I am part of his unfolding story. And it's not on me. It's not all on me. And so that's what was taking a while for me to come to.
Which is like, it's such an easy attitude that we fall into without realizing as American Christians, because so much of our story does seem like we're controlling it until something like that happens and we go, oh, wow, like, wait, what? I'm not in control of this? What's happening there? And it's kind of like, what you're describing your theology as sounds like, I think it's Christian Smith, correct me if I'm wrong, Aaron, but Christian Smith calls it the moralistic therapeutic deism, where, God's just up there, he's in the trunk. he's there if I need him, but I don't need him yet. He'll be there to help me feel better. He's moralistic, therapeutic deism. But anyway, so
it's like a self-help tool.
Yeah,
God is the self-help tool, like a book at the airport of how to be a better person.
Right, and I think we always need to check and make sure that's not how we're viewing God, because we slip into it quickly. And without realizing it, So I love that challenge.
The picture of the car, and this journey that we're on in our lives, and it's like you were open to God, you're open to Jesus. It's like you can come along, but for now you're in the trunk.
Yeah.
Like, I'm driving. Yeah. I'm driving.
You're
here.
welcome. You're welcome to come along for the ride, but and then I like even that. Okay, now he's moved into the car. It's a great way to think about it, and I think something so many of us can relate to.
Hey, anyone that knows me, that has ever ridden with me, knows I'm a horrible driver. So the analogy makes it even funnier that I have this unbelievable driving assistant that I first have in the trunk, and now at least I'm accepting slight, suggestions from the backseat driver. But the real key was not just getting into the front, but like what if I did let go of the steering wheel,
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they're like, girl, let someone else drive.
Let someone else drive. You are terrible.
Okay, so Flannery OConnor, I love Flannery OConnor, and I love her writing about writing, because I don't know if you guys have ever read much of Flannery OConnor, but her stories are very shocking. Like, she was accused of being grotesque, and because she would just tell this shocking story, but when she was writing about her own writing, she said that it's in violence that grace appears, and not necessarily violence like somebody's getting killed, although in some of her stories they do, but it's in that shocking suffering or violence that we're faced with. Do we choose grace or not? So it sounds like that's the next part of your story. You kind of alluded to there was a greater thing to come that took you further down that journey. Are you comfortable unpacking that a little bit?
Sure. So it's interesting. So, I said that I kind of had up and to the right theology. If you just work hard enough, you can figure it out. And so I still think that even with my son's illness, we thought, well, we doubled down and we found the best surgeon, and we worked our way out of that son being healthy again. And a few years later, I say that our theology evolved to splatter paint theology. It's not up and to the right theology. It's all over, life's all over the place. And we realized it. We ended up moving to Nashville a few years later. My husband's family had been here. I had gone to school here. And when I got to Nashville, I hung up a little consulting shingle because that's what I had been doing. And I ended up being part of creating a new school, a new high school. I joined a launch team of a new high school. And it's a very interesting part of the story because I'm so glad I did it. I know that I was supposed to do it. It's part of how God was preparing me to be doing what I'm doing now. But I did it for the wrong theological reasons. I did it because I did it first as a consulting project, and then they said, do you want to stay on? And my bad faith and work theology thought that working at a school and helping students was more helpful to God than working in corporate America. And therefore, I was becoming a better Christian by working in education. And so I had been working for the school for a few years, and my oldest daughter, who at this point I have 3 children, my oldest daughter was in the 2nd grade. We noticed all these skills were starting to, she'd been very precocious at first. Up until this point, we were noticing a loss in a lot of skills. And it was very insidious to the point that I kept going to the doctor going, I think something's wrong. She kept taking blood tests, nothing's wrong. We even went to a CAT scan, nothing's wrong. A different doctor even said, maybe it's your anxiety you're projecting on her. I'm like, well, I guess that could be the case. And her 2nd grade teacher had been out for 6 or 8 weeks with cancer treatment. And her 2nd grade teacher came back to school, their first day back from her remission, and called me by noon and said, what is going on with your daughter? She is a shell of herself. This is not the child that I left. She needs to be an MRI machine immediately. Like, something is wrong with this child's brain. And so this was a very catalyzing event, but it had happened so insidiously and so slowly that all of us that were with her day to day were kind of like, I think something's going on. But it was like, a frog in hot water. You can't quite, as the temperature goes, you can't quite tell you're in the hot pot. And so that was a very galvanizing moment. And, I can make a very long story, the medium version or the short version. But she was diagnosed a few days later with a terminal brain disease. And she's doing great now, but she was diagnosed with a terminal brain disease. I remember the exact day that at the school, the assistant head of school came and knocked on the door and said, a physician needs to talk to you. And I remember getting the phone call. I remember exactly what was said. I remember what Sarah was her name, the assistant head of school. I remember the jacket she was wearing. And I did not go back to work for 3 years. And it was just this journey of, this child, this precious child. That is when the back seat didn't work anymore. You cannot work your way out of a terminal illness. And you cannot work your way out of a shiny up and to the right theology for people who work hard. They can't lose their daughters, right? That doesn't work anymore. And so, the beauty is it was a very long, hard battle, and there's parts of it that still go on today, and she's 24. 23? She's 24. She'd kill me for not knowing that. But the beauty, don't listen. The beauty of that story is that I would not want her to have to relive one single day of that suffering. But without that suffering, our family would be so different. Jesus took the wheel. Now, we fight over it now because, we're human and we're functional atheists at times, and we forget and we think we're in charge. But Jesus took the wheel at that time. Now, something that's very unresolved in me, and you may have listeners listening who got the terminal diagnosis and theirs died. And mine got the terminal diagnosis and is living and is thriving. And so I can't resolve that, right? I don't know, I don't want to say, oh, so many prayed, so my child got to live, when so many prayed for someone else's and theirs didn't. So I want to be super careful on this, just sacred territory of, I know that God gives us all suffering and that he makes all things good. And my child did get to live, and I know some other mothers whose children didn't get to live. So I'm not sure what to do about that. But it was in that suffering that I was out of work for a number of years, and I was out of work outside the home for a number of years. My work inside the home was really to shepherd that healthcare journey and to shepherd our family through that healthcare journey. And that healthcare journey included 3 major medical centers, 4 comas for 4 days or longer each, a clinical trial of sorts in Germany. It's a really long healthcare journey, but it also involved a full theological rearrangement of my heart, and a real understanding of we are part of a larger unfolding story.
Can you talk to us about what that looked like? I mean, I can imagine what that looks like, but just even describing, so when you talk about, now he took the wheel, now your whole theology has changed. What did that look like even in your day-to-day life or your marriage with your husband, or just as a family, how you, did it involve okay, we need church community, or okay, now I need to study the word because I need to learn about God, or, what were some things that you remember in that time that really did cause that shift in the suffering?
I think the shift in the practices came later, but it was the supernatural peace that supersedes all understanding. And just this knowing that it did not feel like we were going to be okay, but we still felt like we were going to be okay, right? And it was these tiny, tiny little things where God was in some details that were just like, wow. And an example is so she had been diagnosed with a disease called leukodystrophy. And if anybody is listening who has a child with leukodystrophy or has lost a child with leukodystrophy, I'm just so sorry because I don't think there could be any worse way to lose a child. And what a leukodystrophy is that your brain starts degenerating and just degenerates until you die. So it's kind of like, I don't know, a children's version of something like what Lou Gehrig's might be like or ALS might be like. And we were going through the process of getting tested for which leukodystrophy she had. And they're like, she doesn't test as any of the known leukodystrophies. So we did some research and we realized that there was a doctor at Hopkins that traces unknown leukodystrophies. And so at midnight one night, we were just like, we're getting on a plane tomorrow and we're going to Hopkins, and we're like fighting the clock here. We don't know. We might only have a month left with her. And so we could have 5 years, we could have a month, we don't know. So we are going to go to Hopkins and we're going to sit in the lobby and we're going to call this doctor of unknown leukodystrophies and say, I know this is crazy, but we're in your lobby because somebody's going to cancel someday. And when they cancel, we're going to be here because we don't think we have time to wait to get in. But we know somebody's not going to show up one day. And so the funny thing is we were on Caring Bridge, This was in 2006. This was before we used the word things gone viral. I had never even heard of Caring Bridge. The only reason we got a Caring Bridge is because a friend said, there's this thing called Caring Bridge and you won't have to call all your family members if you just write what happened at the doctor there, and then they can all read it and it'll just take some energy off of you. And so I did that, and then one day I logged into Caring Bridge. I was like, oh my goodness, all these people have read this? Who are these people? Well, so anyway, we had said on our Caring Bridge in 2006, before most people knew Caring Bridge existed, we have decided that we are going to go sit in the lobby of Hopkins and wait till somebody doesn't want to see this doctor. And we got off the airplane and we walked into the lobby, and this man said, are you the Wallace family? We were like, yeah, we are. And he said, you know what? Dr. Moser is waiting for you. Anyway, Dr. Moser has passed away. Someone read our Caring Bridge and knew Dr. Moser and called and said, this little girl is coming to see you. And he saw her that day. So on the one hand, it feels very entitled because we had the financial capital that we could just get on an airplane, right? And apparently we had the social capital somewhere in our Caring Bridge world that called this doctor, right? Not everybody had these things, but for some reason we got to benefit from these things. And so Dr. Moser, who's passed away now, saw her and spent a lot of time with her and said, I don't think she has a leukodystrophy. I think it's an autoimmune disease. I think her brain is on fire and we have to get it. It's like swollen and going crazy, but I don't think it's a leukodystrophy. And he was right. He was right. So it ended up being 5 years of getting things calmed down and getting her, that was second grade. She was out of school for quite a while, or tried to be in, tried to be out. She'd get too sick again. She'd have a seizure. She'd be in a coma. She would lose all her skills again. We'd have to teach her 1 + 1 again. She wouldn't know who we were. She'd forget her parents. Just chaos after chaos after chaos. But she was finally ready to re-mainstream to traditional school in 7th grade. And anyway, at that point, I went back to school to work at the school, and I also started in seminary. So I was like, I have got to figure this out theologically. I didn't finish seminary, by the way, but I did start.
Wow. So you were seeing some miracles. That story is crazy that you would walk in. That was part of the theology shift you're making, is now you're seeing miraculous things happening.
I still couldn't process it, right? I still couldn't, and I still have a hard time processing. So I'll tell you this other just beautiful golden nugget. And it's at the other end of the story. It's after I've gone to seminary for just enough time to understand faith and work theology and to realize I've missed it for my entire career. And so now I've started this nonprofit about faith and work theology that really came out of my daughter being sick, that made me realize I had bad theology, that made me start seminary, that made me figure out I had worked my whole career with the improper view of my faith. And so I'm about 2 years into this nonprofit, and I'm on an airplane going to meet other people that run faith and work nonprofits. And I was actually pretty tired. I think I was, like a typical person that founded something. I hadn't really had much time to process it. I was sitting on this airplane. I was pretty tired. I was actually teary, just a little teary. And I said, God, I think you wanted me to start this. I'm quite sure I felt your nudge to start this, but are you wanting me to continue this? Because I am really tired. Am I just a starter and someone else should continue it? Like what? And I did not, I was journaling and on the airplane, and I did not get a clear answer. However, I went straight from that airplane to this dinner with 6 people, all in the faith and work space, and I knew 5 of the 6. And I sat down next to the one I didn't hear. They all beat me there. I just come off an airplane. And the one I didn't know, this is a miracle related back to the health struggle. The one I didn't know said, how'd you get in the faith and work space? I said, oh gosh, long circuitous story, a corporate career. I did it all wrong. Secondary education, I loved it, but got into it for the wrong theological reasons. A really sick child and a good book in the seminary. And she was like, she picked up on really sick child. She goes, oh, I used to be a pediatrician. What did your child have? I said, oh, it's this crazy thing. I don't know if you've heard of it. And I called the official name of it. And she's like, oh my gosh, I have never heard of a child with that. I said, well, I think we were the first one on record, and it was a crazy time, but she's thriving now. And she said, well, what did the doctors use to finally get it in remission? I said, well, they started with this, and it worked for a while, and then it didn't work, and it didn't work. And then finally the Mayo Clinic helped us figure out that this one drug got it in remission. It's called rituximab. And a tear just came out of her eye and rolled down her cheek. And she said, my husband was on the team that invented and launched rituximab. I'm like, are you crazy? Like, I just on an airplane said, God, do you want me to keep going? And then he sits me next to the person whose husband helped create the drug that saved my child's life. Like, I'll keep going, right? I mean, I call that a golden nugget.
Did you just hug her? I would just.
I mean, we just couldn't even believe it.
On to your husband, please. Yeah.
I mean, we just couldn't. She invited him to something the next day, and we took some pictures together, and we thought someday we'd make a video of it, and tell the story. But we've never gotten around to that. But that'll forever be a very special moment to me, to be reminded of. I guess here's another theological kind of thing I have a problem with. Does God really care what parking space I get, right? So part of me is like, there's no way he cares what parking space I get, right? But he cared that I sat right next to that lady that day, right? He cared enough about me to orchestrate me to get that detail of encouragement.
Oh, I love that so much. I love that. I'm glad that you drew that out too, because yes, that is the God that we serve, that cares about those sorrows. I mean, Isaiah says he took on our transgression, but he also took on our sorrow, and he uses that sorrow to bless us in a way. But I have to make a funny connection, because a lot of our guests talk about the suffering throughout their life, and so many of them are talking about their sorrow and their suffering, and then they talk about picking up a book on systematic theology or taking a seminary class. And I just love that. I love that. I just love that. Like you said, hey, I got some things to learn here, and just went for it. So if we could transition just a little bit. Tell us how you started making that connection that, my faith, you told us a lot about it, but how did you start organizing that connection for yourself? Faith has everything to do with how I view my work.
Mm-hmm. So it's funny. I started, this program that was in Nashville. I can't remember if it was the first semester or the second semester. But the class that I wanted was not available because I was so late to it. Well, I'll even give you more detail than this. So I was waking up in the middle of the night, and I just felt like you need to go learn more formally. You need to go learn more formally. And I was like, if I tell my husband that I'm taking something on top of my full-time job and my 3 children to bring into our family, I really think green peas may shoot out of his ears. And so I was really scared of. Not scared. My husband and I have, a wonderful partnership. Not like, I'm scared to tell you, but I was like, I felt this check in my spirit. Like, how can I tell my partner in this that we feel overtaxed, but I'm going to take on some graduate classes? But I just decided to do it. I was like, I'm just going to take one and see how it goes. He's like, all right. And so I think it was the first one, but it might have been the second one. The class that I wanted wasn't available, but the class that I could fit in my schedule and they could fit me into the class was about creating missional strategies. And so in our study at the end, we had to write a project. And the thing that I had, in the years leading, between kind of my daughter getting sick and to where I am in the story right now is probably, 6 years or so. And during all that time, I had read several books that unlodged a lot of understanding for me about idolatry and the just our true brokenness and how it shows up in so many ways. Counterfeit Gods was probably just a seminal Tim Keller book for me to really be like, oh my gosh, I get it now. I'm really starting to get it. And so I was in this class on missional strategies, and I had exposure to another book that Catherine Alsdorf and Tim Keller wrote, which was called Every Good Endeavor. And Every Good Endeavor, I call it the beach read of faith and work theology. If you do not understand what faith and work theology is, if you do not understand how to apply your faith to your work, other than should I tell my cube mate about Christ, you need to read Every Good Endeavor. Every Good Endeavor is where I was like, oh my gosh, I missed it. And I actually remembered back when I was in bank training back in 1989, sitting in a church pew, and I actually remembered hearing a sermon, Blessed are the Meek. And I had the next day in the relationship management development program of the bank, I had, we called it RMDP, I had a negotiation training test. And I had to do a fake negotiation live and be evaluated. And I remember thinking, okay, I can't be meek tomorrow. Blessed are the meek doesn't work in that class or in, that training. And I never thought about it again. I never thought about, does what I hear at church impact my work, until I read Every Good Endeavor. Well, that's not quite right. I did think about it again when I took my job at the school, because I thought I need to work in a helping profession to serve God, right? I knew I couldn't be on the A team and be a pastor. I didn't feel that holy. But I felt like I can help people. That's serving God. I'll work in a school. I'll help start this school. So anyway, Every Good Endeavor made me realize, oh my goodness, all good work is bringing structure out of chaos and trying to call it good. And that's the exact pattern of Genesis. And that we were called to work before the fall. We were told, go out and create flourishing in all different spheres of society before the fall. And so that's when I first understood all that. And my end of the year project for that class, which I thought was going to be create a college counseling ministry that put God at the center of the story instead of the senior in high school at the center of the story. I thought that was going to be my project. But after I read that book, I went back to the professor and said, I've got to change the project. The college piece is just a tiny sliver of it. The college piece says that we think we are at the center of our work story. And so that's why we're getting on this treadmill to go to college, to get the good degree, to get the good job, to get the this. And those are all good things, but they're not ultimate things. We are part of God's unfolding story in all of work. And so my project ended up being this business plan for the Nashville Institute of Faith and Work. And a church here in Nashville, the senior pastor had recently come from New York and had been trained by Tim. I went up and got trained in New York, and we launched it together out of Christ Presbyterian Church in Nashville.
So you started the Nashville Institute of Faith and Work, or it was already existing when you came on?
No, this pastor and I started it.
You started it.
Yeah.
Okay.
So it was a final project in my seminary class, and I remember very clearly it's 5 a.m, and I really felt like I was, kind of finishing off the footnotes or something before I turned it in. And I remember being, is this a paper for a class, or is this about to ask me to leave my job?
Yeah, those are two different things.
Yeah. So then what was the aim of was it then to take now what you've learned and influence people in churches? Was it, you were talking about it went beyond the college age, which is what you were thinking first. So what was the objective of, was it to get into churches and help to bring this Christian worldview to as many people as you could?
It was launched out of Christ Presbyterian, but they very generously made it city facing. And so that it could be not just for the congregants of Christ Pres, but for all of Nashville. And really, the intent was to equip, connect, and mobilize Christians to understand that they are the scattered church out in their workplaces day to day, and that their workplaces are both a way to sanctify them and to help them understand their unbrokenness, but also a way to help them push against the brokenness of the world and be part of God's unfolding story for the world. And so to really help them understand, what does that mean in insurance? What does that mean in advertising? What does that mean in investment banking? What does that mean if you lay tile in bathrooms? What does that look like to see God's creational goodness in your industry, to see the brokenness in your industry, to figure out where God has placed you and how you can push against some of the broken systems?
So I've heard you talk about passion versus calling. And you said something interesting. You said that, and I won't quote you exactly because I didn't write it down, but you basically were talking about how so many people get dissatisfied with their work because they're looking to get paid for their passion instead of their calling. Now, I may have totally made that whole thing up, but that was the gist of what I got. Am I on track with what you've talked about before?
Yeah, I love this topic, and if my daughter ends up listening, which hopefully she won't since I got her age wrong, but it's very interesting because my daughter and I, so I have 3 kids. I have my oldest daughter who's 1 year out of college. My son is a junior in college, and then my youngest daughter is just finishing her freshman year in college. And so my oldest daughter is in a job search situation now. And so she and I have talked a lot about calling and, all kinds of things, and should passion be a part of your job search. And she and I don't necessarily see eye to eye on this. And so I could have it wrong. But I think one of the most important things to say is people say, what is my call? And I think a really important question back is, well, what or who is your caller? So to have a call, you have to have a caller. And so is your caller Jesus? Is your caller appreciation? Is your caller influence? Is your caller comfort, leisure, money? Not that any of those are bad in and of themselves, but if they are the ultimate thing and they become your caller, becomes a problem. And so our primary call as a Christian is to Jesus. Our primary calling is God's child. So then it means that our secondary calling is what we do out of response to that. So there's this great quote by Os Guinness that says, calling is the truth that God calls us to himself so decisively that everything we are, everything we do, everything we have is invested with a special devotion, dynamism, and direction lived out as a response to his summons and service. And he goes on to talk about that, first we're called to someone, but not to something. So we're not called to motherhood or politics or teaching or banking first. We're not called to, a city or to China first. We're called to those things second, and that those things can change over time. And so our secondary callings change, but our primary call never changes. And so it takes a little bit of pressure off. I do see that the people that I've worked with that are kind of age 20 to 35 maybe feel this unbelievable pressure to get it right, to figure out what God has called them to do, and that needs to be the perfect alignment of their passion and the pains of the world and their gift mix, and to be this perfect answer to what God's calling you to. And sometimes God doesn't make it that clear to us, and I'll talk about passion in a second, but I think sometimes God is calling us to the next right thing because he's got the long game in mind, right? So I never would be in the position that I am in now if I had not had a long stint in corporate and a long stint in nonprofit and this understanding of faith and work theology. If any one piece of those things were missing, what I'm doing now would not have come to pass, right? And so I say your call is to Jesus and to listen to Jesus. And he doesn't call people on a megaphone like with, Sarah, do a podcast all that often. You might have gotten that. You might have gotten the megaphone. I've only had the megaphone a couple times. And so if you don't get the megaphone, then I think what he's doing is asking you to pay attention to what gifts have you been given. What things those gifts are yours to steward for him. What circumstances are you in? How can you steward that? So you might have these unbelievable gifts to be an astronaut. Your it wasn't mine, but your circumstance may be that your mother has cancer right now and you feel that you need to help care for her. And so these two may collide sometimes, right? Your giftings and your circumstances. And so then what are your imaginary boundaries that you're putting on yourselves versus what are real boundaries? And pay attention to those, and that is how God is nudging you, right? So when I said to God, should I still be the leader of that organization? I didn't hear yes, no. I paid attention to something else that happened later that day that felt like, I know I'm supposed to be at this table tonight because I just met someone that is an enormous blessing to me. Wow. I'm going to keep going, right? So I think part of the cultural narrative that did not exist, so I'm in my 50s. I don't know how old you all are, but you're not in your 50s. The cultural narrative did not exist for, and I have the gift of a good education. And when I came out of my good education, the narrative was, you better get busy and work, right? You've been given a good education. You better get busy and work. I feel like the narrative of the 20-year-olds now is, you've got to find the perfect right thing. It's got to be perfect. It's got to align to your passions, or you might be missing the boat. There was no I might be missing the boat. It was just like, get to work. You might be missing the boat if you don't have it right. So last year, or a couple years ago, the Gospel Coalition asked if I would write a little something to an answer about should passion be a major job search criteria. And I did all this research, and I came up with the answer that I don't think it's scripturally appropriate, or even social science even proves it's inappropriate for passion to be the main job search criteria. It's okay for it to be secondary or to be paid attention to, but it should not be the main job search criteria.
Mm-hmm. And we're going to link to that article because I thought that was really helpful in thinking about this. And I love that you talked about doing the next good thing, because I think so often, and this ties in with passion, I think so often we go, how can I change the world? And it's disappointing because we're not going to, but it's doing those next steps, the next step that led you to the next step, to the next step, to the next step. And it's listening to where God has for you, and even to the daily choices that we make. It's the listening to his leading and all of that.
Yeah, I was just gonna piggyback on what you're saying, Sarah, but I appreciate what you're saying, Missy, because I do think the way we think about all of this is really important, especially the young people listening and how they are thinking about their future. And if we think that there's this blueprint that for our lives that we have to figure out, what God has already laid out, and we have to figure out the steps, and we could make a misstep and then mess up God's, quote, plan for us, that can be so debilitating and can cause you just to freeze and be like, well, what school am I supposed to go to? Or what job am I supposed to take? And what you're talking about is rooting it in something so much deeper, which then actually frees you up to look around and, like you said, do the next best thing and not be crippled by this fear that we're going to mess things up. Because yeah, and just that the God talking through the megaphone is like a normative thing that we should expect. And so we need to be listening to that megaphone where, of course, God's moral will is clear. So we're to live inside his moral will and obey, those laws that he has set out. But then as far as will for our lives type of thing, well, if we're living within his moral will, we actually have a lot of freedom, what you're talking about, to start the thing or to pursue this job or to take 3 years off like you did and stay home with your daughter and all of these things. And we're not crippled with feeling like we may make a misstep and we can't make the next step until we hear the megaphone from God. And I just love everything you're saying because we have to get this right in our theology because it really does affect the way we see ourselves and the way we see God.
I was just going to say what you're saying, Erin. I think it was Luther that said, love God and do whatever you want, which of course sounds like what? But I mean, if you're loving God, it's kind of to your point that if you're loving God rightly, then do whatever you want, not whatever you want, but whatever you want is going to be in line. Okay, I'm like explaining it too much, but you know what I mean.
Well, I mean, I think that there's 2 verses that I think explain this well, and one is Romans 8:28, and it says that all things work together for the good of those who love God, who've been called according to his purpose. So it's kind of says that, if you are, we're never going to love God perfectly. We're all going to make mistakes. If we don't need God if we know how to love him perfectly, right? But if we really are trying to listen to God and trying to, he's going to make good of it. He's going to make good of it, and it may not look good on this side of heaven, but who knows what it's going to look like on the other side when the new heaven and earth are together. And I think my favorite passage about work is Ephesians 2:10, because it says, we are his workmanship, created in Christ Jesus for good works, which God prepared beforehand that we should walk in them. And so if you think about my story, if you think about me being a 24-year-old banker, do you think I had any clue that I was going to end up? I didn't even know I was going to go to business school and then work in consulting and then work in Asia and then have really sick children that led me to some new theological truths that then led me to start a nonprofit in Nashville, which now has me working for a nonprofit in New York that is serving Asia, right? I mean, it's crazy circular. And I couldn't have planned that, right? God prepared that. And so I feel like that I can look at Ephesians 2:10 now at age 53 completely differently than I would have been able to look at it at age 24, because I can look back at the circuitous path and I can be like, whoa, he did create me to do good works, which he prepared in advance for me. But it's only in Christ can I do that. Can I do this? So I don't know. I think it's amazing.
Yeah, and it's oftentimes when we look back that we can see how God used this circumstance to prepare us for this next circumstance and so on and so forth. But like you said, rooted in Christ should cause us to feel a freedom and not a frozenness of what we can do, but actually a freedom of what all we can do to live in line with God's mission for the world, to stay within his will. There's so much that we can do. And then, yeah, to your point, it's oftentimes when we look back and see, oh, wow, that's why God allowed that to happen, or, oh, this is why that time was so good for me because it prepared me for this next thing. Okay, Missy, I want to hear just quickly, what are you doing with Redeemer City to City? Can you just tell our listeners a little bit about what that work that you're doing is including?
Sure. So when I was part of the Nashville Institute for Faith and Work, I trained with some people associated with Redeemer City to City on how to launch a Faith and Work Institute. And so 5 years later, when there was some leadership transition, I don't think we get this opportunity very often, but the author of Every Good Endeavor, Catherine Alsdorf, that book that really kind of changed so many things for me, she and I became really good friends through the work. And when there was a transition of leadership and they asked her to try to find a new Faith and Work leader at Redeemer City to City to teach other churches and other cities how to launch Faith and Work initiatives, I ended up taking that job. And so my job part of my job is to help other churches and church plants in cities launch Faith and Work initiatives. Redeemer City to City as a whole, it's creating movements it's catalyzing movements of the gospel in major urban cities of the world. And so Faith and Work is a leg of that strategy of how to have impact in the cities to bring movements of the gospel, hopefully. I need to rephrase that. So, Faith and Work is one of the strategies of how the gospel can impact the hearts of the people in the city and impact the city through their work. Part of what we hope the Spirit's doing by creating movements of the gospel in major urban cities of the world. And then I also, half my job is around Faith and Work, and the other half of my work is, because I have a past background in consulting, Redeemer City to City in New York has a lot of people whose expertise has been in this space, and we consult to various regional affiliates around the world. And so I align a lot of the consulting work and with our regional affiliates, which are, we have Latin America and Europe and Asia Pacific and the Middle East, et cetera, et cetera. So I help align how we're serving all of them.
So you're mentoring a lot of people in how to integrate their faith in work. Okay, so I have a question for you, because we're in a strange cultural moment, and integrating your faith with work could get you fired, with so many different professions and, whatever it might be. In fact, I was just talking with one of my daughters who's interested in counseling, and she's in high school, and we were talking about how, hey, who knows what counseling is going to look like, but right now it's pretty strange, and so many counselors are being forced to affirm things that they do not agree with or be fired. And so here's kind of a twofold question. I kind of would love for you to speak to young people who are trying to figure this out right now, how to integrate their faith with their work, but also kind of have a theology of getting fired, because there's a time where when you speak the truth, you might lose your job. And so how do we encourage young people in this way? Not to get fired on intentionally, but you know what I'm getting at?
Yeah. So I think it gets down to discernment and what do you mean by faith and work? And so faith and work can mean overt evangelism, and it can mean talking about Jesus at work, but it doesn't mutually exclusive or have to mean that, right? And so
no, right, and I'm not even talking about that.
Yeah.
I'm just talking about living out your convictions,
yeah,
and not proclaiming lies to be truth that aren't true.
Yeah, and I think that's discernment. And so there's this, I'll send you this this graph if you link things to things. And it's Tim Keller's made this graph called a cultural engagement model. And it's a 2x2, and I love 2x2s, but it's hard to explain a 2x2 in an audio. But it basically shows you that when you engage culture, there's a lot of ways you can do it, right? You can do it by trying to change culture, but you might be trying to change it too much and take too much power. You can do it by trying to accommodate to culture, but you might accommodate too much, right? And so anyway, this 2x2 shows you that there are 4 different quadrants you can be in that are all biblical. You can come up with a biblical example of when you should speak and when you shouldn't, but if you go too far in any quadrant, you truncate the gospel. And so I think there's a lot of discernment on when you need to push and when you need to hold back. And there's an article that's been written, I can send you this too, called Exilic Discipleship. And as most American Christians take a Jerusalem mindset that the Christians are in charge and the Christian way should be the right way, but where in reality some of the data is showing that we are in exile right now. The secular world is exile. And so if you look at some of the exile themes through the Old Testament, God said when, the people of God were in Babylonia, I want you to get into the culture and love the culture and marry people in the culture, right? And so there are different models of when I think you need to speak truth and when you need to think about what's the main thing and what's the secondary thing. I just had this conversation with someone whose wife is working in public schools in a city in the Northeast and being asked to affirm some things about gender choice that does not feel that aligns with her faith. And so we were talking about this concept of exilic discipleship and what that might look like in her decision-making sphere. When do we proclaim the truth of Christ with words versus when do we do it with actions? And I think Catherine Alsdorf gave me this lesson one time. She said, everyone wants to come to a faith and work class with their current ethical dilemma of the moment and get a black or white answer. This is what you do if ... She said faith and work is about a long journey of listening and discernment and biblical truth and knowing when you're called into sitting in the dark and being a loving, faithful presence, and when you're called to eject, when you're willing to stand up for truth and be fired, and when I think it's discernment. So that kind of sounds like a weak answer. I think there's polar versions of it when, absolutely, something deceitful, horrible, dishonest, wrong, etc. is going on. Do you need to be a whistleblower? Absolutely, especially if someone else is being oppressed. But if we're in exile and we're in Babylon and there's some non-Christian behaviors going on that are not consistent with the Christian life, that aren't oppressing and hurting people, when do we speak up? When do we not speak up? It's hard to say.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, and I think that discernment comes from obviously prayer, seeking the Lord, getting advice from wise people in our lives, all those things. And actually what you're saying, Missy, is reminding me of Solzhenitsyn, and Rod Dreher tells a story in his book Live Not by Lies, but where sometimes what we're called to do isn't necessarily to be at every rally, to do this or do that, but just to not give in to the lies. It might just be to be the shopkeeper who doesn't post the communist letter in their store window, or the teacher who stays in the job but continues just to teach truth, and she or he won't teach lies. And it's a good point towards discernment, and that we all are going to need discernment, and God promises in James to give us wisdom when we ask. And so we need to ask him for wisdom in all these different situations that we're going to find ourselves in, and it will look different, for depending on what we're doing. So that's good advice. Okay, Missy, you have given us so much time, and we are so thankful. But before we let you go, we have to ask you a few questions that we love to always ask our guests. So one of them is, and now you have already mentioned so many books, and we're so thankful, and we're going to link to all the books you've already mentioned, and the articles and the diagrams, whatever you'll send us. But is there a book you're reading right now, or books? Maybe you're a several book at a time gal. But what are you reading right now?
So I have been reading, actually I just finished it, and I'm going to pronounce the author's name wrong, so I don't even want to pronounce it, but I've been reading a book called Homegoing. It's just a really interesting story that starts in Africa and traces two different African lives, one that ends up in America through slavery and one that does not, and how they reconnect over multiple generations. It's a really, really great fiction book.
That sounds so interesting. We'll link to that. Okay, last question. What woman, if you could choose any woman from history to have coffee with, who would it be?
You gave me that question ahead of time, and I meant to think about that. I think the easy, biblical answer is that it would be really fun to sit down and talk to them two Marys, Mary the mother and Mary Magdalene, and just really Mary the mother. Like, what was it like to be like, oh my gosh, I think my kid's special. Like, what was it like when you couldn't find him in the temple and he's talking to his father? And what was it like when, when did you really figure it out? How scary was that? What was it like to be pregnant and know that you were a virgin? Like, what was your life like? I just think that would be so interesting. And then I think it would be really interesting to talk to a major figure who really lived with incredible oppression but kept the faith and really changed something. So maybe Harriet Tubman or, Rosa Parks, to really understand what that journey was like.
Yeah, those are good ones. Well, Missy, thank you so much for taking this time and spending it with us. We enjoyed this conversation so much.
Thank you, Sarah and Aaron. It's really nice to be here.